Good evening. Welcome to Friday night at the Charleston Literary Festival. It's sort of weird. The end of the festival is already in sight, but it feels like we just started yesterday. But it's been quite the ride this year. I don't know how many of you have been on this ride with me, but from storms and floods to 80 degrees in November, there was just no predicting what this year's festival was going to be like. But I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see all of you. Tonight's sponsor, Catherine Federowitz. Many of you all may not know this, but in addition to supporting tonight's session, she's become an integral part of our festival team. You know, the newsletters you get and how beautiful our website is, that is all Kat's work. And I just want to thank her very loud and very clear from my little soapbox up here. Thank you, Kat. So now we move on to the session at hand. I am so happy to stand before you tonight to introduce two amazing speakers and a book that is truly a delicious ride through a strange and brave new world. Sandra Newman is an American writer who weaves together tales of dystopian adventures in novels like The Only Good Thing Anyone Has Ever Done and The Country of Ice Cream Star. I love her titles. You may remember her from her appearance in 2020 when we were fully virtual, when she was speaking about her very haunting novel, The Heavens. And tonight, she's here to talk about The Men, which, while a less exciting title, is her latest book, and it tracks a world in which everyone with a Y-chromosome suddenly disappears. And while sometimes after a particularly rousing conversation with my boss, who I do not see but who happens to be male, I sometimes think that's really nice and it sounds really fun. But I also think we can all acknowledge that the world would be very, very different. I did call this book delicious earlier, which might sound strange for a book, but it is. It's yummy. There are beautiful characters and gorgeous storylines, and there are a bunch of unexpected twists that honestly made it one of my favorite reads of the 2022 festival season. Here to discuss this wild ride with Sandra is one of my festival favorites, Regina Marler. She's a remarkable writer in her own right. She writes for the New York Review of Books and is the author of, I love this title too, Bloomsbury Pie, The Making of the Bloomsbury Boom. She edited Queer Beats, How the Beats Turned America Onto Sex, and Selected Letters of Vanessa Bell. And she just comes back to us year after year, and I'm so grateful to have you here on stage with us. One quick reminder before we get really started is that books will be on sale in the lobby, and Sandra has graciously and generously agreed to sign. So please buy many, buy for Christmas. It's that fun of a book. You're gonna wanna give it to people after you read it. And now I'm gonna exit stage that way and let Sandra and Regina talk about The Men.
I guess I will stand at the podium and just read a few pages from the beginning. So as you know, all people with the Y-chromosome disappear, and it happens in an instant, and that is page 1 of the book. So, when the men disappeared, it felt like nothing. I was camping in the mountains of Northern California with my husband and my son. It was dusk, and the sky was all one color, grayish-violet, silken, dim. The lime-green leaves of the alder above me were trembling and luminous, brighter than the sky. In the tent, my husband, Leo, was reading on an iPad and letting our 5-year-old, Benjamin, who had night terrors, fall asleep against him. Through the tent's mesh window, I could make out the iPad's light. I was lying in a hammock, putting off joining them. It was August, hot even up here in the mountains, and I had an idea about watching the stars come out and feeling wild and solitary, bound to no one. I wanted to indulge my fantasies of escape, of being a prima ballerina in Japan or sailing solo around the world. Fantasies in which I'd never married and had my whole life free. Still, I felt my husband and son there and loved that they were there. I was in love with them. I didn't want to be single and childless. I wanted to fantasize about it with them there. I wasn't worried by their long silence. There had been times I was frightened in the world, bad times. This was not a bad time, and I was happy. At 7:14, an intense nothing happened. An elation that wasn't of the nerves or the brain. I would later recall it as being like drugs. When it passed, I felt Leo and Benjamin were gone, but quickly dismissed the idea as foolish. Mood swings were normal for me and often accompanied by bizarre ideas. I looked to the tent and saw the tablet's light, a vivified spot. I didn't call out. I didn't want to wake Benjamin. I went back to my thoughts. At about 8 o'clock, I fell asleep. Down the mountain, in the world of people, women were already calling the police. They were running through their houses, screaming names. They were pounding on neighbors' doors for help and finding their neighbors running through their houses, screaming names. They were driving to police stations and discovering them lit and empty with the doors left open. Small aircraft were falling out of the sky. I went to sleep on the mountain while the world fell apart. I slept right through till sunrise. Their living voices, gruff and deep. The sound of a man in another part of the house. Boys hanging from branches like monkeys, hooting and kicking out at each other. How 3 boys could sound like 10. Drumming on a table, whistling, masculine, unself-conscious noise. Gone. Too few women on this committee. Another board of directors with no women. Men making decisions about women's bodies. Gentlemen's clubs, men's rights, women's magazines, feminism. Gone. Watching a boyfriend play computer games, laughing at a man's story, then another man's story. Bracing yourself when he shows you something he made, the relief when it's not bad. The girl act, putting on a little girl voice, wearing flat shoes to make sure he's taller. The big hand on your shoulder, him telling you it's going to be okay. You're beautiful, said with that authority. Letting him take over, letting him drive, letting him decide. Him carrying you to bed, the rush of being sexually helpless before it, being an object of desire for men. Gone. The suffocated feeling of being talked over, a man putting on a high voice to mock you. At a party, a man's eyes passing over you to find a younger woman. Him answering your question, but addressing it to her. 2 men talking for a young woman's benefit. She mutely attends as if judging a contest. You say something, and all 3 wait impatiently for you to finish. No one hearing you because they don't want to look at you. Standing at a mirror in a public restroom and seeing what they see. Him getting scary, him punching the wall, keeping your head down and letting it pass, being ashamed you set him off, being proud you didn't. The moment you realize you're not in control, all the magical thinking falls away and you're a body being killed. Or just coming to a group of men at a street corner, them falling silent and staring as you pass, not at your face. Footsteps behind you in the dark, big hands on your throat, not being able to stop him. Gone. Your father, your brother, your husband, your son. Okay, let's stop there.
So Feminist utopias. You've said that this was your pandemic novel, that this is one of the things that came to you when you were negotiating the strangeness of that. Put those two things together for me.
Okay, well, I think that, like, I'm fascinated by feminist utopias, and I think the thing that is really fascinating, or became super fascinating to me about them while I was writing this book, is that unlike any other kind of like fictional utopia or imaginary utopia, feminist utopias always start with the men gone. It's a very genocidal sort of fantasy, you know. It's never, and usually what people do is that they imagine that the men were killed by a plague 1,000 years ago so that you get that out of the way and it's not your fault. And, you know, the genocide just happened somehow, something happened. And then the women invariably have a different society. I mean, invariably, if it's written by a woman, have a brilliant society where there's, you know, joint property and children are raised communally and everything. Mm-hmm. It's almost always communist in some way or another. And always there is an emphasis on women being able to do things that they can't do in our world, and an emphasis on there being no sexual violence. Mm-hmm. So
I love that.
I haven't tied that together to COVID, where obviously those things didn't happen.
But we will. But right there, I was thinking about there is running through this. There's grief. There's loss. It's not as if there's an immediate celebration that life is a lot easier now. Haha. There's a hint here and there. You say relatively early, when your main character has rejoined a group of women, has come out of the mountains having spent 10 days looking for her husband and her son, and she encounters women, and they're kind of making do. You know, it's a sort of camping out kind of situation. No one knows what to do yet. And there are children around and women taking care of them. And you say, in that moment, I was struck by how profoundly a scene was changed by the removal of a masculine element. It felt very sweet and fantastical, a world of lambs with no wolves. At the same time, it was oddly reminiscent of a rebel encampment on the eve of a raid. So there's the knife at the end. So you're allowing for a complicated response there in your characters, and it feeds it. But anyway, the pandemic. Why this now? Or then, I should say.
Well, there was something about, I lived through the pandemic in Manhattan, so it was a very intense experience. Everything changed dramatically. The city really emptied, and I remember very, very early on, just when the lockdown had started, there was one night I was around the World Trade Center area going running, and I was the only person on the waterfront. The only person. Wow. And it was extraordinary. And you really felt like, oh my God, the world is falling apart. Is this the future? Are we here? And what happened, I think, for New Yorkers, there was this very split kind of feeling where, on the one hand, there were sirens all day, sirens all night, and you heard the ambulances going, and there was a lot of fear, and of course everybody was still disinfecting their groceries and, you know, wearing masks to walk down the street. But at the same time, there was no traffic, and children were playing in the middle of the street, and we actually, my husband and I got to move into someone else's house that's much nicer than ours, so I think this was part of it for us, that we were house sitting for some people with a much nicer house. But we would like ride bikes home to our place through the city where it was suddenly very empty, and it was weirdly idyllic. And the thing that I always remember from that summer is that in New York there was a kind of a plague of fireworks, which New Yorkers complained about a great deal, but I personally loved. especially like I do run along the riverfront, and you'd run along the riverfront, and there would be these professional grade fireworks going off all along the riverfront, where all of these bored people were entertaining themselves during the lockdown, and keeping my neighbors awake, which they complained about and came up with all of these conspiracy theories about, actually. But it was strangely, I don't know, it was strangely utopian while being dystopian at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. The premise is that the men disappear, immediately, and so of course there's as you say, some planes drop out of the sky and some things like that. But there, in other recent post-apocalyptic literature, like I'm thinking of Station 11 here, what's lost almost immediately is technology. They lose electrical, and very soon they lose food, and the small bands of survivors of the pandemic she describes wander. And in a way that when they do try to rebuild society after the societal collapse, they're going back to what we imagine might be, village life, something, a simpler time, a primitive vision. You chose not to strip technology away, or even, there's some issues with gasoline, which limits people's movements, but why did you choose to allow yourself that? It opens things up, certainly.
Well, it's interesting. I think we were talking about this before we came on, and I think that in almost every book of this kind, unless like there are certain books, like I think Max Brooks's World War Z, where he actually was fascinated specifically with the question of what exactly would happen in real life if there was a zombie plague, and it's a really fun book, but generally that is not the author's main concern, and the author is trying to tell a story, and I think Emily St. John Mandel, when she wrote Station 11, for her it was interesting to have technology completely go away, and that was a lot of what she was interested in writing about, and writing about the fantasy and the fear of a world without technology. Whereas I was completely not interested in that, so I was trying to kind of avoid that issue, and deal with the world. You have to address it, especially there is this kind of question: can women do technology? And it's interesting, a lot of reviewers got hung up on that. They were very upset that I thought that women could do technology, which is really funny. Like, there was a surprising number of complaints about the fact that I assumed that women could technology. So I don't have a particular opinion about this, actually, but I certainly think it's completely possible that women could do the technology.
Women fly planes, yes.
Yeah, women do fly planes.
Women could.
Women can fix things, actually. Not, I can't, but so it was hard for me to imagine personally, but yeah. So really it's more about where the focus is. And for my book, I have a plot element which requires the internet to work, and therefore I really had to have the internet work.
Yeah. So you have mass media, which is interesting, so people actually know that, what's happening in Brazil to some extent. You've got mass media, you've got social media, and new social media that arises as a result of this plot element, these strange videos that begin to appear. And it's stunning that you've managed to introduce something that's more nightmarish than the prospect of having lost the men, which is there's a hint that the men may not be lost, that there is an alternate reality in which they may go on in some way. So the characters at various points are facing all sorts of choices about how to proceed, which reminds me a little bit of the book just before this, The Heavens. Also speculative fiction, and you have time travelers. They start out in, as I recall, they start out in a kind of a very nice version of New York, and when your main character travels and returns, travels to a specific character in Elizabethan England and returns, our reality degrades with each return. So you don't just keep two realities going. You have an interpenetration, and it's not a happy place.
What
The interpenetration between the video world and and the world of the women who are suddenly without the men, just as in the heavens between the past and when you come back, and the present reality has degraded somewhat each time.
Yeah, the videos, I think it's kind of interesting. The videos seem to show, it's not like somebody is streaming online. There's a website where you can go, and it appears to show where the men have gone. And you just see the men marching through this strange landscape, and they seem mesmerized or even lobotomized, possibly. You can't tell. There's something terribly wrong with them, and there's something strange about the film. And you can't tell if it's meant to be a place on Earth, or if it's real, or if it's fake. So most people just decide it's fake in order to move on with their lives, as I think.
It makes things easier to forget. But the video kind of forces them to continue to confront.
Yeah.
What's going on with the guys? Yeah, maybe, or perhaps it is, there's a lot of speculation, and some people do think that this is a kind of weird work of art. Yeah. So that's obviously, that's one of the benefits of keeping technology in there. You have said that the novel for you is about othering.
Yeah.
And you said it in a specific context in a New York Times interview that was about a controversy that has arisen about the book. And was the controversy primarily on Twitter, or did it spread out? And you can tell me what the beef is there.
Okay, the controversy, it's not just a controversy with this book, although I think it came to a head a bit with this book because it had been building with previous books that have similar premises. So basically the controversy is based on the idea that the people who disappear are people who have a Y-chromosome. So that seems to be defining men and boys as people with Y-chromosomes, which is something that is considered like really intolerable and offensive by trans people. And if you read the book, it's not really like that. It's more complicated. But when I was announcing, it's hard to describe the premise of the book without making it sound that way. And at the end of the day, it is people with a Y chromosome who disappear, and the book is called The Men. So for people, like not all trans people are really that concerned about this kind of thing, but for people who think about, I guess, literary criticism in identitarian terms, it's actually a big deal.
Yeah.
So I knew this was going to be a problem, but you just have to live with the decisions you make, actually. Mm-hmm. So, but when it came out, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter a lot, and it turned into a gigantic thing on Twitter, and then a friend of mine who had defended the book actually had an award nomination withdrawn as a result of her defending the book. And she was really just telling people, if you'll excuse my foul language, because she's a very foul-mouthed person, she was just saying to people, well, you seem like really fucking stupid saying this about a book you haven't fucking read. That was more or less what she said over and over again. Mm-hmm. And she's a gay writer, and she was up for a Lammy, which is it's probably the most prestigious LGBT literary award, and they withdrew her nomination as a result of this because somebody must have complained and said that she was transphobic, and that turned into a gigantic thing.
Wow.
And as I say this, it sounds like there must be something more to this, but it actually was just that. It was one of these Twitter dramas, I think, that make sense to people on Twitter.
Yeah. Blew up a bit. And there is, I can understand people getting incredibly upset about the, the casual remarks of others, because I think increasingly identity politics, plays a role in all of our decisions and all of our artistic choices. Did you feel especially daring choosing to, in a sense, define men as Y-chromosome holders?
No, it really, I mean, I knew it was a problem, but
Yeah.
I attempted to write it the other way, where the people who left were
Male identified, or
exactly,
Yeah.
like where trans men disappeared and trans women stayed. And I could go into like all the problems that causes, because it just causes a different set of problems. There's no way to write the book without entering into some kind of difficult space. And this space, I think, was, for me, it ended up in a less painful place for any trans reader who actually reads the book, which I think trans readers who have actually read the book tend not to have a problem with it.
No, because you do address them, and there are trans people in the book and so forth. So.
I mean, I'm sure somebody would, but that's
Yeah.
how it goes.
So you have a pretty exciting next project, too. You are reimagining 1984.
Yes.
How did that come about, and where are you in all of that?
Well, basically, my agent works with the agent who is the literary executor for George Orwell. And we had this conversation about me writing a book which would be 1984 from the point of view of the character of Julia, who, for people who know the book, it's the girlfriend of Winston Smith in the book. And so basically, and it all has to do with it. 1984 is coming out of copyright in the UK, so that sort of changes the entire environment for these kinds of books. And I wrote but it wasn't yet out of copyright, so I actually had to get this guy's permission to write the book, and I did a whole outline.
It used to be the Orwell Estate used to be a really difficult one.
Yeah, which is because of Bill, actually.
Oh, interesting.
He's very tricky. He's extraordinarily possessive of Orwell. And defensive isn't that protective? I guess. Protective of his legacy. Whereas the actual descendant of Orwell, I shouldn't be telling this sort of gossip, but the actual descendant.
We like
Orwell,
gossip, right? Okay. Yes.
Whereas Orwell's grandson doesn't care at all, and really, when Bill went and spoke to him about it, he just laughed and said, "Orwell never quits, does he?" That's like his response to the whole thing. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm just finishing the book now. So I've been writing these terrible scenes where she's been tortured before I came here.
Yeah, yikes. So it's London, 1948, I think?
Yeah, well, nominally 1984, yeah.
Yeah. And you went to England for a couple months, but you lived in England for years and years. So does it help? Do you have the English in here?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, the book is written, of course, in this sort of, well, like 1984, it's written in 1940s British voice. So it's
so you kind of ventriloquize. You've got.
Yeah.
How long did it take to get Orwell's voice in so you can reproduce it?
It was pretty straightforward. I did live there for a long time, so really, I just read the book, and I mean, Julia does have a very strong voice in the book, so she actually has a lot of personality.
How does it feel writing pages and pages of torture?
Oh, It's depressing, actually. It is depressing. It's funny, I just had my husband read those scenes, so he reads everything that I write, so I sent it, it's like 30 pages, which it sounds like a lot, but in the original, it's 60 pages that Winston Smith gets tortured. It's absolutely endless. So my poor husband was made so wretched by these. He's a gentle soul.
Yes. Okay, so you were almost finished with that.
Yes.
And is there something on the horizon?
No, I've actually been working so hard that I haven't had time to really think about what my next move is. I have these fantasies about thinking about. I actually fantasize about thinking. You know, when you're like working that hard, you're like falling asleep, and you have a fantasy about a time in which you will be able to think, which you should just think because you're there. You could think, but somehow.
It's interesting. There's so much in the men. It could have. There's, oh my gosh. There's trauma. There's coercive control. There's sort of sex trafficking. There is a lot about race. There's class. There are all sorts of the various utopian ideals that try to come into play. The relationships that arise in that new world without men, and so forth. It could have been much longer, but yet it's got this. It has all of that, but it has a propulsive energy that I really admire. And tell me a little, if you can, without giving away a lot of trade secrets here. But tell me about your process. Is this boiled down from a big messy draft, or are you a sentence-to-sentence writer, like a Cynthia Ozick, or someone who perfects a sentence, moves on? How do you get to this?
I used to be a sentence-by-sentence writer. It's funny. I've just gradually moved in the other direction, and now I do these. My process. I start with an outline, and then the outline gets fatter. So within the outline, I start writing like little bits of scenes. And I almost always, and then I'll make another outline because this outline gets too thick and I can't deal with it anymore. It's like 20 pages now. So then I make a simple outline, but that one begins to develop and metastasize in strange ways. And then I'll often do an outline of a chapter within the outline. So it's become this strange sort of crazy wall process, actually.
Planning beast.
Yeah.
Lots of things there. How different are these outlines? Do you reconceive? Having explored this, do you reconceive it?
Yeah, well, that's part of it. You end up being in an antagonistic relationship with your previous outline, because I think my whole process is that I'm extraordinarily easily bored. So I become bored with everything that I've already written and want to take it in a new direction the entire time. And I've tried to discipline myself more as I've gotten older, because it can become extremely chaotic.
But it's working. So chaotic, painful to you maybe, but it's working. I think it is time to take a few questions. If we could have house lights.
This might be a spoiler, but do the men come back?
Oh. Oh, that is a spoiler. But yes.
There's a question in the front.
Microphone on the way. Thank you.
It's me, it's Leah. One of my favorite parts about the book was the very different storylines of each character. The main one of which, and please forgive me because it's been a long week and I don't remember anyone's name. I mean, I know your name, but the main narrator, she has this whole life as a ballerina, and things happen when she's a ballerina. And I would love to hear more about where that came from. Were you a dancer? Or, like, it's just such a very specific thing that I've been dying to ask you more about why.
That is a super rich backstory. So,
Yeah. It came from a lot of places. I mean, it's funny that the whole ballerina thing, actually, I don't have a background as a ballet dancer, but I was trying to, it's from another book that I abandoned, which was about a ballet company. It was a ballet company, and then there's a nuclear war. So it's like a ballet company trying to survive in this ravaged landscape after a nuclear war, which it just never quite came together. But I spent so much time watching ballet and going to ballet and learning about ballet. So it's kind of an orphaned plotline from that. And the whole, I think I was in the theater when I was young, and it seems to me that, I don't know if anyone's read Trust Exercise, but that sort of relationship of the director or the head of artistic director of any kind of performing arts company, where there are young people who grooms the kids and has relationships with them which inhabit this kind of space where the teenage kids think, oh, maybe this is love. And it's not clear to them yet that it's actually exploitative. So it sort of comes from that, and it's a very extreme version of that in the book. But that's certainly, I had that relationship with the director of my children's theater group, although in an interesting wrinkle in my personal case, this is not the case in the book exactly, he turned out to be using me as a 16-year-old girl as cover for his real relationship with a 16-year-old boy in the company, which at that time in the 1980s was like a completely unthinkable thing. So,
did you know?
I did not know at the time, and there was all of this kind of intrigue between the three of us.
But that's part of it, and I think to some extent it comes through here because your main character is so young that she really doesn't know, other than the glamour of the leader of the ballet group. Other than that, responding to that glamour and hoping to be included, in the sunshine, she doesn't really understand what's happening, tends to blame herself for having been profoundly manipulated. And then society is quite happy also to blame her. We like a simple narrative. We like a black and white. And I think that colors her response when the men disappear as well.
Yeah, I think one of the preoccupations of this book is sort of how, when victims are victims and aren't victims, and also how society, I think it's in human psychology, people are really in denial about this. People really do want to blame victims for being victims, even when they try very, very hard not to. It's hard not to think less of someone who has been victimized.
That is a strange and sick thing about us. That's true. Yeah. And it's a factor as she moves through this new world. She has to negotiate, to what extent she is to blame for that aspect of her past, and also for other difficult choices that arise in the course of the novel.
Yeah.
And it adds a terrific tension in there. Is there another? There are questions, several, halfway or so.
I haven't heard them yet, but I'm certainly going to. Oh, sorry.
I advise it.
But listening to the subject matter that you addressed, I was interested in the race issue, whether you found any difference in a woman-only world in terms of amounts of prejudice or a kinder, gentler approach, or if you found them to be very similar to the world we knew.
Wait, I'm not sure. I'm missing a few of your words. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just said in your approach to the race issue, did you find that there was any difference in the way women handled it, whether it was a less prejudiced, a more kinder, gentler approach than you would find than you found in a male-female?
Were we less racist,
Yeah,
basically?
yeah.
Yeah, or
In the absence of men.
Yeah.
I think I wouldn't say that, but I think there are different patterns and different ways that racism manifests between the genders. I mean, now people talk about Karens, for instance, and I think there is a way in which white women express racism, which is just different and unique, and I think, like in some ways, I think the emphasis on white women as the racists now, which certainly on Twitter is the case, has been overemphasized, but I think it's been really good for everybody to have a time of thinking about that, and that's definitely in the book, just the ways that white women and black women relate to each other and how hard it is for those relationships of, I'm thinking of it as a power relationship in this book rather than as a relationship of prejudice so much. There's certainly prejudice that turns into hatred and violence in the backstory, but in the present where it's women relating to each other, there are these. I don't know. Like, women are just open in different ways. I mean, women could be very sneaky and underhanded with each other and not necessarily always honest. And I think a lot of women are socialized to approach difficult situations in a kind of a roundabout, polite way where honesty is impossible, actually, a lot of the time. And I think that
People-pleasing is essentially a dishonest form of working our way through the world, and yet, it's a social lubricant. But
Yeah.
it's there's a fundamental.
not everybody does that, but I think
Yeah.
people are sort of taught to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, as you were researching and visualizing what an all-female society would look like, were there any ancient civilizations or cultures that informed your view, or was this all your imagination that brought it to life?
I'm just trying to think. I don't know about ancient civilizations. There certainly have been all-female communes and like utopian societies that have existed, and at least one still exists. But I don't know if you can learn that much from them. I think actually, in fact, my mother lived in a women's commune for a while. And so to give you an idea, like in her women's commune, it eventually ended up splitting into two women's communes because all of the cool women, well, really, like the uncool women became angry at the cool women for excluding them and treating them as less than, and so they split off and created their own separate women's commune. So I think, like, really what tends to happen is that a lot of the same things, the same problems that already exist are reproduced, but there is, like, even in that you sort of feel, well, that feels female, that feels like a female problem somehow, like that's the kind of thing that would happen.
Well, we establish our status in various ways.
Yeah.
Men do it too, but they sometimes even put an actual rank on it, in the military and so forth. So I think we do it. We can't help it. My thought when you described that split, that the cool women go, here and the uncool here, was that it wouldn't be very long before the uncool women establish who's cool,
Right.
in their group.
Yeah, and honestly, I can't remember which side my mom was on. Which I feel like
critical.
Maybe she didn't mention that.
Okay. Maybe in the back and then down in front.
I just wanted to thank you for giving me a new word to describe oatmeal. And I don't know if you recall this, but one of your characters describes the scent of oatmeal as furtive. And for me, for the rest of my life, when I eat and cook oatmeal, I just thought that was very apt, and I was wondering where that came from. To
Oh, that's-
describe oatmeal as
That's great. I can remember exactly because originally the word was intimate. It's the intimate smell of oatmeal, and I thought that was perfect. But I already had the word intimate like on the previous page, so I had to change it. So that's where it came from. I was trying to think of a word that was like intimate but not intimate. And I was not satisfied with it, so I'm very, very glad that it worked.
You know, there's a reader for every book, for every word. Even you have found your reader for this word. And then think down here on the right.
Hi, thank you for being here. I've not had the pleasure yet of reading your book, but a question that did come to mind was, as you were constructing it, you were telling us about your process and the attention to detail within the outline form. As you were creating and identifying situations, did you end up with an unintended consequence that was a surprise as you were going through creating this world?
Did I end up with a
Unintended consequence that was a surprise to you that you had to really figure out how to
Do you
attend to?
anticipate all your conclusions, or are you surprised?
In fact, yeah, there are a few things. The ending was extraordinarily difficult for me, and I came up with so many different endings before I found one that worked. So that was definitely an example. And there's also there's a kind of a climactic event that's a backstory event with a character, Evangeline, who, I mean, she actually, I don't want to, this would be a spoiler, but basically the villain of the entire piece who brings this into the world, who is the one, like, kind of supernatural character in a sense, was a surprise to me, and I didn't really intend her to be there. And she kind of appeared towards the end and solved a lot of my plot problems. And she's a really interesting character. She's a character I've worked with before who I think is kind of a character who has, I don't know. It's actually a long conversation about how if you've ever gone out with someone who actually has sociopathy, they obsess you for the rest of your life, and you think about them whenever. And so this kind of sociopathic light character became the solution to the question of how the men got taken away, and that was definitely a surprise for me.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. It's an especially dark little moment at the end. There are some bittersweet elements to the end, but boy, that was a dark one. Yeah. And in the middle, on the left, my left.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for the talk. You mentioned a little bit about your process writing The Men. Could you tell us a little bit about your process writing or rewriting or reinterpreting 1984? I wonder how much research you have to do, how much is based on imagination, and is it daunting?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's been a really strange process because I've decided that it's the same events, only from the point of view of Julia. And I mean, there are differences. Winston never really knows exactly what's going on and whether Julia works for the thought police and all of these things. So it's a different interpretation of those events, but it's the same events, and some of the exact same scenes happen, which means that the same dialogue happens. So I'm working around Orwell's dialogue. So that's really strange, to write a scene where somebody else has written all of the dialogue and then to fit in your interpretation of it around that frame. There are only a few scenes like that, but then you have to work up to those scenes, and it is very daunting. Sometimes, and it's interesting working with someone else's novel, because there are moments when you think, I'm just going to look stupid writing a book that will inevitably just be held up next to 1984, and the immediate thing that people will think is, this is not as good as 1984, so you become daunted by the parts of 1984 that are really genius. But there are also, not to, like, I have boundless respect for Orwell, but he was very ill when he wrote 1984, and there are moments where he dropped the ball and kind of made a bit of a mess, and there are things that don't entirely make sense in the book. Mm-hmm. So you also kind of have to deal with that and make sense of them. Now I'm trying to think. So the process, it's interesting. It's very much an enabling constraints process where you have to make it work within a very narrow set of parameters.
It feels quite different. Although inevitably, I mean, you have a certain facility with language that you could apply to nonfiction or fiction or anything else. But it does seem a different thing entirely. If you're working toward a particular bit of dialogue, original dialogue that you know you want to include, need to include, you've got to figure out your pacing to get there to have the impact that's needed. You need to not pull it one direction or another thematically or otherwise, and that's, that is different.
And also to make it work, to make it interesting, I sort of had to have it had to be different from Orwell in a lot of ways. So that's another thing. Like, you can't have the same plot and you can't have the same emphasis. So a lot of what I ended up doing with it was filling out the details of the world around it. And it happens, I studied Russian at university, and I actually spent some time in the Soviet Union before it fell, and have been fascinated by that culture all my life. So a lot of it is like filling out like Orwell's world with details that aren't exactly Soviet, but are very similar to Soviet history of the time of the Purge.
Amazing. I didn't know that about that you'd visited the Soviet Union. That's perfect for doing this project. What a great idea. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just wanted to take a moment to say thank you both again for being here tonight. What a great session. What a great book. Go buy it. If you haven't read it, read it. You'll thank me. I promise. And we'll see you all tomorrow, okay?